Mohamed, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
In the book you published earlier this year, The Only Game in Town, you're indicating what you believe are, based upon your analysis, are the limits of monetary policy as a means globally to support economic growth. And you're indicating, based on your analysis, that there should be a shift over towards the fiscal policy side in order to help sustain economic growth. Do you think that there is a political consensus within the OECD countries and other economic forums to bring that about?
There is a technical consensus. So most economists agree that we cannot continue relying on central banks, that we are starting to see the exhaustion of central bank policies, and that we need a handoff, a policy handoff. And that handoff includes more active fiscal policy as one of the four components. So the good news is you have a technical agreement. The less good news is that the political configuration is such that nothing is getting implemented. There is complete paralysis. Part of that has to do with the growth of the anti-establishment movements on both sides of the Atlantic that has tended to paralyze the ability of traditional parties to act. And the result of that is, while you have technical agreement, you do not have political implementation. How do you unblock this? I worry that it only gets unblocked with some sort of crisis, some sort of shock. And the only question in my mind is, how big does that shock need to be?
In looking at the run-up to the 2016 election here in the United States, and then also other political contests elsewhere in the world, do you think you see any signs of hope that perhaps a centrist consensus, absent a crisis, may come about?
Not as yet. And I think that while the focus in the United States is rightly on the race for the White House, it's Congress that's going to really matter. If Congress remains divided, then it doesn't ultimately matter that much who comes into the White House, because we have a system of checks and balances. There's a limit to what you can do by executive order. Europe is in even earlier stage. They got the Tea Party later than we did, and they're still trying to cope with what does it mean to have the amount of anger within the population. You see it in the Brexit debates. You see it in the emergence of the anti-establishment movement. So I do not think that we're going to solve the political problems without a major shock of some sort.
Shocking enough that we have more than $10 trillion in sovereign debt securities with negative interest rates. Is this something where really it's a view on the part of fixed income investors that long-term rates of return are going to be going negative? Or is it perhaps more an instance of where the quantitative easing that has been used as one of the monetary policy tools since the 2008 recession has perhaps gone too far?
It speaks to all this, and basically speaks to what a strange world we're living in. And investors should take pause and think a little bit about what's been going on. Negative interest rates. You lend your money and you pay the borrower for the privilege of giving them money. Now, that's absurd. And yet, it is the reality on almost 1/3 of global government debt, over 30%, on 16% of investment-grade corporates. That's become the reality. So something that was an unthinkable is now a reality. Why? Several reasons. One is central banks have experimented too much, and we're now seeing the collateral damage, the unintended consequences of that. And there is collateral damage. You cannot run a modern market-based economy at negative nominal interest rates. Things start to break down. Second, we are seeing people recognize that it's been a wonderful ride in the equity market. But equity valuations now are very decoupled from fundamentals. We can no longer rely on central banks as much as we did before, and therefore, you know what? I'd rather know that I'm going to lose just 10 basis points or 15 basis points than take risk in the equity market. And the third element is regulatory driven. Banks, other institutions have been forced to hold more of the safe bonds. That has driven demand up, has pushed prices up and yields down. I think the key issue is to recognize that this cannot continue for a long time. And it feeds into the basic hypothesis of the book, which is we are in this T-junction. The road we're on is slowly coming to an end, probably within the next 2 to 3 years, We're not going to be able to continue as is, but there are two very different outcomes depending on what the political class does.
You've indicated that outside of entities that have regulatory requirements, negative interest rates are a significant disincentive. If we look at, say, those economies that may have seen these negative interest rates for longer, have we seen actual disintermediation where depositors, whether from an individual standpoint or from an institutional standpoint, have opted to withdraw their funds from the system rather than to have them remain within the financial system?
You're seeing in Japan, the sale of home safes has shot up. Why? Because people say, I'd rather keep the money at home than pay for a bank to keep it. You're seeing the damage politically. The Bank of Japan is under tremendous political pressure. That's why, after it's experimented once with negative interest rates, it's run back to the sideline, too scared to do anything, even though the yen has strengthened enormously. You're seeing it now in the circumstances facing any provider of long-term financial services. We can't insure our life individually. We pool to insure our life. But no new provider of life insurance would provide us life insurance today. Why? Because there's no way they can make money and keep our money safe with negative real interest rates. So you start with negative nominal interest rates. So you're starting to see the damage being created in the system. And yes, individuals are responding. Japan, for me, is the leading indicator. Keep a close eye on Japan because it tells you what can go wrong if we continue with this low growth, excessive central bank involvement scenario.